we've made it to maybe nervous system part 3. So you've talked about the parts of the brain and kind of what their different functions are. So now we're looking at how that is protected inside of your skull, obviously. It's incredibly important for the brain to be protected. There is some discussion in one of these things about concussions. Some of you might have your own experience with concussions and the effect that they can have on neurofibers and on memory loss and things like that. And so your brain is well protected, not only by the skull, but also by these other things that we're going to talk about in order to help prevent brain injuries on a regular basis. Obviously, if you're playing a sport, or if you get into an accident or something, there are extraordinary circumstances where the protections that are there aren't enough. But there's a lot of different layers of protection to help try to minimize any damage done to the brain. So, we start, of course, with the scalp and the hair, so that just provides a covering all the things that the skin does and preventing infection and whatnot are there. And then you have the skull, and surrounding the skull is the periosteum, so bringing nutrients and things to the bone itself. And then the part that is kind of different in the brain are the meninges. And so there are several layers of membranes called the meninges collectively that surround the brain itself. So there's the periosteal layer, and then the meningeal layer of, it's called the dura mater. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. And then the arachnoid and the pia mater. So all of those very, very tough membranes are surrounding the brain and helping to keep everything inside safe and together and bathed in fluid and all of that. We'll also talk a little bit about cerebrospinal fluid, which you can kind of see here, that helps, again, to provide some cushioning. So here's just another image. You can see the brain in full there, the skull, the dura. There's a space in the dura as well to kind of add some more cushioning, subdural space, the arachnoid. So the next slide has a picture from a cadaver, so it's a little bit, it's not gross, but you might find it a little bit gross. Just to warn you, skip the next slide if you want to. Here we have the different layers. So here, this is showing the different layers, starting with the scalp that's been resected, the epicranial aponeuroses, which is like a tendon, basically holding muscles. The frontalis is up here. Loose connective tissue and periosteum, the cranium there, and you can kind of see it going around. And then we have the dura mater. See how sort of thick and strong that is, kind of holding the brain, and they're surrounding it. So even if something were to happen to the skull, perhaps the dura would continue to protect the brain. It would also help, keep stuff out of it, even if something were to happen to the skull. The arachnoid is sort of this reddish looking stuff. And then there's a space, the subarachnoid space, kind of beneath that stuff. And then right on top of the cerebral cortex is the pia mater, that innermost layer of protection. And all of this would be bathed in cerebral spinal fluid as well to help provide, regulation of salts and things, but also to provide protection and cushioning as well. So the meninges layers, we're going to talk about them from outermost to innermost. And the first one, the outermost one, is what's called the dura mater. Mater is German for mother, and dura means tough. So it's the tough mother. It is a double layered covering, the outermost covering. It has, as you saw in a picture, the periosteal layer, which is attached to the periosteum of the skull. So scalp, periosteum, skull, periosteum, and then the periosteal side of the dura. And then the other side is the meningeal layer, and that is next to the arachnoid. So it's got lots of inward folds, sort of undulating, and it helps to limit movement of the brain, keep it in place so it's not bouncing around, which would be bad. So the next slide, again, is showing the dura mater, but it's kind of a picture from a cadaver, so proceed with caution. So here you can see the dura here, and then the brain. It's really a thick, tough covering, and we'll see it when we do dissections in a couple of weeks. Okay, the next layer of the meninges is the arachnoid layer. You might be familiar with the word arachnid, which means spider. So arachnoid is sort of spider-like. In this layer, it's really web-like, which is how it gets its name. It's delicate, it's transparent, and it is the middle layer of the meninges. Next, we have the pia mater, which pia refers to delicacy, so it's delicate mother. It's a thin connective tissue membrane, and it just clings right to the surface of the brain. So the dura is up over the top of everything. The arachnoid is sort of webbing in between the dura and the pia, and then the pia mater is right touching the brain. So several layers of defense and protection and membranes surrounding the brain to help protect it. Additionally, to help protect and also nourish the brain, we have cerebrospinal fluid. So that is the fluid that is bathing basically the brain and the spinal cord all along the central nervous system. It forms a watery cushion to help protect the brain. So you can kind of imagine your brain like floating almost in this little bath of CSF. Not only does it protect, it also helps to circulate nutrients, in particular glucose, which you need for your brain, which is why I always tell you to eat breakfast before you come to take your test, because you need sugars for your brain. So the cerebrospinal fluid helps to circulate that as well. So it's not just for protection, but it also has really important nutritive values as well. Within the brain itself, so there's cerebrospinal fluid all over bathing the brain, but within the brain there are also these spaces called ventricles. You don't need to know the particular ventricles, just kind of that they exist is fine. And so the cerebrospinal fluid is not only bathing the outside of the brain, but it's also flowing into these ventricles and helping to bring nutrients and things into the brain as well. Okay, last thing, second to last thing. So your brain not only is well protected physically with your skull and with the meninges, but it's also protected chemically by the capillaries that are in and around the brain. So your brain has the least permeable capillaries of your whole body. Very few things are allowed to exit the capillaries and enter the brain. So that prevents harmful substances like urea, which is a component of urine. That excludes them from getting into the brain, because if that happened, that would be bad. It could kill the brain matter. However, it's not a perfect system, of course. And so certain substances that we kind of wish couldn't get into the brain can get into the brain because of the chemical structure. So fats and fat-soluble molecules can still cross the blood-brain barrier. Respiratory gases, CO2 and O2, that's good. Alcohol can cross that barrier. Nicotine can cross that barrier. So those are examples of things that we wouldn't want to cross the blood-brain barrier, but they can because of their size and their polarity and things. And then the final one is anesthesia. So certain chemicals that are used to anesthetize a person before surgery can cross the barrier, which in this case, it's good because you don't want to be awake if you're having surgery necessarily. But all of these things can cross that chemical barrier, even though many things are excluded that would otherwise be harmful. So not only are there physical protections for the brain, but there are also these chemical protections for the brain that work together to hopefully keep your brain happy and healthy. Last thing, I just wanted to show you this. This is the bundles of nerve fibers. So we saw muscle fibers bundled in a similar way. So this is how nerve fibers are bundled. The axon in the myelin covered with the endoneurium, the innermost membrane. That bundle is covered in the perineurium, and then the whole bundle of bundles is covered with the epineurium. So just kind of reminiscent of what we saw with muscles. There are no neurium questions on the final. All right, you have one more section. Make sure you watch section 4. Bye.